Welcome everyone! Today's Bobby Fischer game will teach you two things. One, you'll see how Fischer tackles a slow pawn move in the opening. And two, you'll see what happens when white chooses the wrong piece sacrifice. Let's start this off. In this game from 1970, he faced Yugoslav GM Dragoljub Minić. Minić had white and opened with e4, c5. We know Fischer loved the Sicilian. And after they entered the open Sicilian, Fischer of course opted for his favorite Najdorf variation with a6, ruling out any knight to b5 or bishop to b5 move and preparing to go b5 later on. Now in this position, bishop to e3 would be the start of the English attack, which is historically the most played move, but bishop to g5 was white's choice in this game. e6 allows the queen to defend the knight and prepares bishop to e7, and after f4, Fischer could go into the poisoned pawn variation with queen to b6, exploiting the fact that the bishop has left the defense of the b-pawn, and Fischer actually did have good results with this. In today's game, however, he went for the main line with bishop to e7, and this also promises a sharp game. Queen f3 prepares castling queenside, and the queen may support f4, f5 one day. Then queen c7, castles, and knight b d7. Black always has to take care that white cannot play e4, e5. That's one of the reasons for bringing the queen to c7 and the knight to d7. And now white starts his attack with the classic pawn storm with g4. Fischer answered with black's standard pawn move b5, hoping to one day push white's knight with b4 and develop the bishop to b7. But white continued his attack. Bishop takes f6 was played, which after the recapture allows him to go g5. And after knight to d7, we must admit white's pawns look somewhat menacing. White will definitely want to play h2, h4 as well, and black's king hasn't castled yet. Although if black wants to castle, it seems he has to castle into the pawn storm. But this is all known theory, and by far the most played move nowadays is actually f5. So white gives up the g-pawn with check. And after knight to e5, white brings the queen to h5, and white may follow up with rook to g1 or h4. There was a game between Karjakin and Ivanchuk from 2015, for example, that followed that line. However, that wasn't played in this game. At this point, Minić went for a3, which aims to stop black from playing b4, but this move isn't considered very good anymore, and that may have to do with this game. Fischer answered with rook to b8, and that's definitely the best move. Black prepares to go b4 anyway, and it also has the benefit that it steps out of the sight of white's queen. If white would ever go e4, e5, then the queen isn't attacking the rook anymore. White continues his standard strategy of advancing the kingside pawns, but Fischer gets his play too. Pawn takes, rook takes, so Fischer starts to get some activity on the queen side, but after bishop to h3 he still needs to be a bit careful. A sacrifice on e6 may come at some point, or simply f4, f5, and Fischer somewhat surprisingly actually castled here. Fischer really believed in the soundness of the Najdorf structure, and he wasn't afraid to castle into white's attack, but white actually did have a strong move here, and knight takes e6 actually is a sound sacrifice. After pawn takes, bishop takes and king to h8, since the e-pawn is now gone, white can play knight to d5, already winning material back. After queen b8 and knight takes e7, the game remains very sharp. Knight e5 exploits the pin of the f-pawn, and after queen to c3, black takes on e6, white takes the knight, but black can then go rook to c4 and hope to infiltrate with the rook on f2, and certainly black isn't lost, but it is tricky and really only white can be better. However, this didn't happen. If we go back to the game, I guess white believed Fischer and didn't dare to sack on e6 anymore. Instead though, white tries to sacrifice in another way with knight to f5, and he tries this to get the d5 square for his other knight, but the problem is that if black doesn't accept the sacrifice, then the move isn't really good. And Fischer indeed does not take the knight. Knight to c5 was played, targeting e4, and especially after bishop to b7, the e-pawn will be a problem for white. Minić tried to make the best of his mistake and took the e7 bishop, and then continued his pawn storm. But really, this is just too slow. Bishop b7 was next, as expected. The pawn is now hanging. Objectively speaking, white should just defend the pawn with the rook, but white was set on attacking himself and advanced his h-pawn again. But as I said, white's attack is not in time. Black took the e-pawn. White took on g7. White now wants to attack black's h-pawn, but that's just not going to happen. Also, the rook was planning to leave f8 anyway, and it did. Rook h2 guards the second rank, but here Fischer does make a mistake himself. He could have won quickly with queen to c7, planning to infiltrate with the queen via a5. White can then try this desperado bishop takes e6 and then hope to attack on the h-file, but then queen a5 anyway, threatening mate. And if the queen blocks, then rook to a4 and white can basically resign now. Instead, Fischer went for rook to a4, threatening mate, but here they kind of trade mistakes. White played the very logical king to b1, but then he got in trouble again. White could have been okay with b3, and now the check isn't really a big issue. And after the trade, which is still the best move, you can see black isn't really threatening anything. However, going back to the game, after king to b1, Fischer doesn't give Minić another way out. d5 is a great move. Now he's planning to give a check on c3 and bring the queen to a3. c4 allows the queen to take on c3, so that threat is halted for now, but of course that pawn can simply be taken. Bishop f1 prepares a counterattack with queen to h3, but actually white is lost. Rook to b4 was next, then queen to h3, but Fischer already worked out that he has a forced win. Starting off with knight c3 check, king to c1, knight a4 discovered check. If the king tries to run to the king side, then black can first stop the mate threat, and black is already material up, but the attack also continues with queen a7 check and then bring the knight back into the game, and also simply running with the a-pawn is good enough as well. White instead went king to b1, but now please enjoy Fischer's final assault. Rook takes b2 check, seemingly just giving up the rook. However, after rook takes, knight check, and king to c1, the queen finally joined in, planning a deadly check on a1. White tried this quote-unquote counterplay with bishop to d3, hoping Fischer misses mate in 1, but of course he cannot really have expected that would happen. Queen a1 was played. If king to c2, then queen d1 is mate, so king to d2, but after queen b2 check, king e1, and knight to e4, Minić resigned. Let's see how it could have ended. Black's threatening with queen f2 checkmate, so let's say bishop takes knight, but then black gives this check, and after king to f1 and queen takes bishop, black is already 2 pawns up and he's threatening f4 as well. And if instead queen to e3 to guard f2, then black has more than one way to win. For example, queen to g2, now black wants to check on h1 and then fork king and rook with knight c3 check. And if black just takes a bishop off again, then again black is simply 2 pawns up. Black could even simply go for the queen trade and activate the rook some more. 2 more pawns are now hanging, and it's simply child's play for Fischer to win that. Nicely played by Fischer. It wasn't perfect play, but it was more than enough. If we go back to this final stage of the opening, white went for this a3 move, basically giving Fischer a target, and soon Fischer had this active rook. Fischer then did make a mistake by castling here. White could have sacked on e6, but instead he tried to sacrifice in another way, but Fischer simply ignored that and piled up on white's weak e-pawn. Fischer then didn't really face any resistance, and it didn't take long before they reached this position. White tried this last-ditch attempt to counterattack, but Fischer already had it figured out. A couple of checks, a rook sack on b2, and when the queen arrived, Fischer forced resignation very soon. Again, nice game by Fischer. If you also enjoyed, please do me a favor and simply like the video. There's many more games in the playlist that you can also check out. There'll be another great game tomorrow, so I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.